all of that, there are some really valuable pieces of information the public is learning from the files once we kind of separate the wheat from the chaff. Today, for instance, we learned that during Trump's first term, this is back in January 2020, an assistant U.S. attorney wrote an internal email about a review of flight records as part of the government's case against Epstein accomplice Ghislaine Maxwell, who has subsequently been transferred to a low-security prison after talking to Trump's attorney, Todd Blanche. And this is what the email says. For your situational awareness, wanted to let you know that the flight records we received yesterday reflect that Donald Trump traveled on Epstein's private jet many more times than previously has been reported or that we were aware, including during the period we would expect to charge in a Maxwell case, the email states. In other words, during a period in which crimes were being committed. The email added that Trump had been on at least 8 Epstein flights. On one flight in 1993, he and Epstein are the only 2 listed passengers. On another, the only 3 passengers are Epstein, Trump, and then 20-year-old redacted. That seems like a justified redaction there. Remember what Trump said last year on social media, quote, "I was never on Epstein's plane or at his stupid island"? That appears to be patently false, right? We also learned over the weekend that Epstein had 10 alleged co-conspirators. This is probably the biggest piece of news to come out of these documents today. So in another email, this one from 2019, the day after Jeffrey Epstein was charged with child sex trafficking by the feds, an FBI employee asked a colleague for, quote, an update on the status of the 10 co-conspirators. Now, this email also shows the incompetent or possibly malign nature of DOJ's redaction efforts, or at least as yet unexplained. Some of the co-conspirator names were redacted, and that would appear to be a violation of the law under almost all circumstances. You can't redact someone's name just because they might suffer embarrassment or reputational harm, even though Donald Trump thinks you should. The law explicitly says you can't. But then, in the same document, some names aren't redacted at all.
I need to tell you about something absolutely wild that just happened, and it shows you exactly how panicked Donald Trump is about the Epstein files. Trump has essentially given up on Pam Bondi's ability to manage this disaster. He's so fed up with her failures, her inability to properly cover things up, her constant screw-ups that somehow keep making the Epstein story bigger instead of burying it, that he's now had the White House take over the Justice Department's messaging. Think about what that means. The Attorney General, supposedly the nation's chief law enforcement officer, has been demoted to figurehead status while Trump's political operatives run damage control. According to a new report from Axios, the White House has begun managing the DOJ's Twitter account in an effort to finish out the year and meet the Epstein file disclosure requirements set by Congress. Let me translate that for you. They're admitting that they see the Justice Department's primary job not as enforcing the law or delivering transparency, but as protecting Donald Trump's image. They brought in Stephen Chung, one of Trump's most loyal political operatives, to run the DOJ's messaging campaign. And what does the Justice Department need better messaging about right now? Only one thing: making sure Trump gets the PR he wants around his criminally failed release of the Epstein files. This is an open admission that they believe the DOJ exists to serve Donald Trump personally, not to serve justice or the American people. And it perfectly captures how this administration thinks. They didn't bring in competent lawyers or experienced prosecutors to handle the most sensitive document release in recent history. They brought in Fox News personalities and political loyalists who are good at riling up the base but terrible at actually managing complex legal obligations. And now that those people have predictably failed, Trump's solution isn't to actually comply with the law. It's to get better at messaging about why they're not complying. But here's the thing, it's not working. Despite all the manipulation and strategic messaging and document dumps timed for maximum political impact, the truth keeps breaking through. And what we've learned just in the last few days is absolutely devastating to Trump's carefully constructed narrative about his relationship with Epstein. By the way, I am trying to do my best to gather all the information I can for you and share it with you. Please leave your likes and comments, and I would be grateful if you subscribed. Let's continue. Chris Hayes broke down one of the most damning revelations, an internal email from January 2020, during Trump's first term, written by an assistant U.S. attorney who was reviewing flight records as part of the government's case against Ghislaine Maxwell. The email says, and I want you to hear this carefully, For your situational awareness, wanted to let you know that the flight records we received yesterday reflect that Donald Trump traveled on Epstein's private jet many more times than previously has been reported or that we were aware, including during the period we would expect to charge in a Maxwell case. Read that again. During the period we would expect to charge in a Maxwell case. That means during a time when crimes were being committed. Trump wasn't just casually flying on Epstein's plane for innocent business trips. He was on that plane during the active period of sex trafficking that Maxwell was later convicted for. The email specifies that Trump had been on at least 8 Epstein flights. On one flight in 1993, Trump and Epstein were the only 2 listed passengers. On another, the only 3 passengers were Epstein, Trump, and a 20-year-old whose name was redacted. Now compare that to what Trump said last year on social media. I was never on Epstein's plane or at his stupid island. That's not spin or exaggeration or political rhetoric. That's a flat-out lie. Trump has repeatedly claimed he barely knew Epstein, that they might have been at the same parties occasionally but weren't close. 8 flights on a private plane, including trips where it was just the 2 of them, doesn't support that story. That's a close relationship. That's regular contact during the exact time period when Epstein's trafficking operation was active. We also learned over the weekend about the 10 alleged co-conspirators, which is probably the biggest piece of news to come out of these documents. An email from 2019, the day after Epstein was charged with child sex trafficking, shows an FBI employee asking a colleague for an update on the status of the 10 co-conspirators. These are people the FBI identified as being involved in or facilitating Epstein's crimes. And here's where the DOJ's incompetence or possibly malign intent becomes crystal clear. Some of the co-conspirator names were redacted, which appears to be a violation of the law under almost all circumstances. You cannot redact someone's name just because they might suffer embarrassment or reputational harm, even though Trump thinks you should. The law explicitly says you can't. But then, in the same document, some names aren't redacted at all. It's completely arbitrary and inconsistent, which suggests they're making decisions based on who they want to protect rather than what the law requires. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer put out a statement saying the Department of Justice needs to shed more light on who was on the list, how they were involved, and why they chose not to prosecute. Those are basic questions that should have clear answers, but instead we're getting redactions and excuses and claims that prosecutorial discretion somehow exempts them from transparency requirements. There's also a case that perfectly illustrates how they're manipulating these releases to protect Trump specifically. In one heavily redacted court filing, an Epstein survivor is quoted saying that a friend of hers was one of many girls who had sexual relations with someone whose name is redacted. She confided in the survivor about her casual friendship with this redacted person and how he definitely seemed to have a thing for her, and how he kept going on about how he liked her prepubescent nipples. That's disturbing enough on its own. But here's what makes it a smoking gun for the cover-up. In another data set released by the DOJ, that same document appears without any edits or redactions at all. And guess whose name fills in that blank? Donald Trump. They redacted Trump's name from one version of the document while releasing an unredacted version in a different data set, probably hoping nobody would notice or connect the two. It's not clear why his name was redacted from one file but not the other, but what is clear is that this appears to plainly violate not just the letter of the law, but the entire point of the law. Now, I want to be clear about something. An allegation is not evidence of a crime, and in this specific case, it's not even clear the survivor is making an allegation of a crime about Trump personally. What she's describing is her friend's experience, and the nature of that relationship isn't fully detailed in what we can see. But that's not the point. The point is that the Justice Department is making arbitrary decisions about what to redact based on who they want to protect, not based on what the law allows. If they're redacting Trump's name from some documents while leaving it visible in others, that's not about protecting victims or preserving ongoing investigations. That's about managing Trump's public image. And it's failure after failure after failure from this administration. Republicans defending this always talk about PR, never about justice. You hear people like Megyn Kelly saying, this is a PR disaster for Trump, as if the problem is how it looks rather than what actually happened. Kelly famously defended Epstein by saying a 15-year-old girl, that's fine, which is absolutely disgusting coming from someone who has a daughter. But that's where their priorities are, not on whether survivors are getting justice, not on whether the DOJ is breaking the law that Trump himself signed, but on whether the messaging is effective. And in a twisted way, Kelly is right that this is a PR disaster. Pam Bondi has no idea how to message, and that's essentially her job in Trump's view. Get on Fox News, defend Trump, then get off and prosecute his political opponents. She's failed at both, which is why Trump is replacing her function on the messaging front, even though she's still technically Attorney General. The White House taking over the DOJ's Twitter account is an admission that Bondi can't even handle the basic task of making Trump look good while he violates transparency laws. But you know what the most powerful response to all of this has been? Bill Clinton's statement. Clinton's office put out a simple, direct message. We call on President Trump to direct Attorney General Bondi to immediately release any remaining materials referring to, mentioning, or containing a photograph of Bill Clinton. That's it. That's how you handle this situation if you're actually innocent. You demand full transparency because you know it won't hurt you. Lawrence O'Donnell broke this down perfectly. If you're in the Epstein files and you believe you did nothing wrong, you should be demanding the immediate release of everything about you. Bill Clinton did that. Now think about all the prominent names you've heard associated with Jeffrey Epstein who have not made that demand. Donald Trump has never demanded the release of all materials mentioning him. He's done everything possible to prevent that from happening. Les Wexner, Epstein's biggest business partner whose name appeared in a 2019 Justice Department email titled Co-Conspirators, has never said release everything about me. He had his lawyer put out a statement saying he wasn't a target and wasn't considered a co-conspirator, which is a very different thing from demanding full transparency. Nobody's ever been able to understand or explain Wexner's relationship with Epstein. Wexner is so much richer than Epstein could ever have dreamed of being. Why would someone of Wexner's wealth and business success be in partnership with Jeffrey Epstein? What was that relationship actually about? If Wexner believes he did nothing wrong, why doesn't he demand the immediate release of all information and photographs? Why does he hide behind lawyers issuing carefully worded statements instead of calling for transparency the way Clinton did? And Trump's behavior is even more suspicious. When Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted of sex trafficking with Epstein, Trump was asked about her and said, "I just wish her well, frankly. I've met her numerous times over the years, especially since I lived in Palm Beach, and I guess they lived in Palm Beach, but I wish her well, whatever it is." Think about that response. A woman was just convicted of trafficking children for sexual abuse, and Trump's reaction is to wish her well, not to condemn her crimes, not to express sympathy for her victims. He wishes her well. New information from the Epstein files revealed that at least 4 of Trump's flights on Epstein's plane included Ghislaine Maxwell among the passengers. Trump was flying with a convicted sex trafficker multiple times during the period when she was actively trafficking victims, and his response when she's convicted is sympathy for her. That tells you everything about where his loyalties lie. An email about co-conspirators released today said that of the 10, 3 were located in Florida and served grand jury subpoenas. 1 in Boston, 1 in New York City, and 1 in Connecticut were located and served. 4 of the 10 are outstanding with attempts having been made to locate them. 1 is described as a wealthy businessman in Ohio. If you were a wealthy businessman in Ohio who knew Jeffrey Epstein and you think you did nothing wrong, wouldn't you release a statement demanding full transparency? Wouldn't you want to clear your name publicly rather than hide behind lawyers and redactions? The silence from these people is deafening, and it tells you that they know what's in those files would damage them if it came out. They know that full transparency would reveal connections and behavior that they cannot explain away. So they're counting on the Justice Department to protect them through strategic redactions and incomplete releases and violations of transparency laws. Trump wanted to accomplish one thing with his handling of the Epstein files: change the public perception. He wanted us to get bored and move on. He wanted us to stop believing the truth. He wanted us to focus on Bill Clinton instead of him. And yeah, Clinton was involved with Epstein in ways that are deeply troubling. Clinton should answer for whatever he did. But Clinton is politically irrelevant right now. He's not the president. He's not running the Justice Department. He's not the one violating transparency laws to protect himself. Trump is the president of the United States. He's the one with the power to release or hide these documents. He's the one whose Justice Department is breaking the law he himself signed. He's the one who's been caught lying repeatedly about how well he knew Epstein and how often he was on that plane. He's the one who has rape allegations in FBI files connected to Epstein. He's the one who wished Ghislaine Maxwell well after her conviction. He's the one who has never demanded full transparency because he knows what it would reveal. The fact that Trump has now essentially replaced Pam Bondi's function with White House political operatives shows how desperate he is. The cover-up isn't working. Every document release, despite all the redactions and manipulation, reveals more damning information. The flight logs contradict his lies. The emails show prosecutors knew he was more involved than previously reported. The co-conspirator lists include people he was close to. The survivor statements name him, and he knows there's more coming because they've only released a fraction of what exists. So his solution is to get better at messaging, to control the narrative more effectively, to time releases strategically, to bury damning information in massive document dumps released right before holidays when people aren't paying attention. But it's not working because the truth is too big to hide. You can't redact your way out of 8 flights on a sex trafficker's plane. You can't spin your way past FBI files containing rape allegations. You can't message your way around the fact that you're violating a transparency law you signed while your political opponents are demanding full release. Trump brought in people to run his administration who aren't competent lawyers or experienced prosecutors. He brought in Fox News personalities like Pete Hegseth, who might be the dumbest person in America, to be Secretary of Defense because he goes on Fox and says rah-rah things that make the base happy. He brought in people like Pam Bondi, whose main qualification is loyalty, not competence. And now those people are failing at the basic task of covering up his crimes effectively, so he's bringing in political operatives to try to salvage the messaging. But messaging can't change facts. The documents exist. The flight logs exist. The FBI files exist. The survivor statements exist. And every time they release more material, even with heavy redactions and strategic timing, more of the truth comes out. That's why Trump is panicking. That's why he's replacing Bondi's function with White House operatives. That's why they're admitting openly that they see the Justice Department's job as protecting Trump politically rather than enforcing the law. This is what corruption looks like when it's failing. When the cover-up starts to collapse and desperation sets in. When you have to keep changing strategies and replacing people and admitting that you're using government institutions for political purposes because the original plan isn't working. Trump thought he could bury this. He thought people would move on. He thought strategic document releases would let him control the narrative. And instead, every new revelation makes his position worse and exposes more of his lies. The question is whether there will be any accountability. Will Congress actually hold Pam Bondi in contempt for missing deadlines? Will courts force the release of unredacted documents? Will prosecutors ever charge the 10 co-conspirators whose names are being hidden? Or will power continue to protect these people from consequences while victims watch their abusers remain free? Based on everything we've seen, the answer probably isn't encouraging, but at least now we can see the cover-up for what it is. We can see Trump's panic. We can see the Justice Department openly admitting it exists to serve Trump politically. We can see the lies being exposed one by one. And maybe eventually, that truth will matter enough that someone with power decides to actually enforce the law, even against the powerful people who thought they'd never face consequences. Until then, we keep watching. Keep documenting, keep demanding transparency, and keep remembering that behind all of this are survivors who deserve so much better than what they're getting.